Hello, my dear friends. Welcome to my channel Sleepy History. Before we begin tonight's story, please tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? I love seeing sleepy souls from all around the world. And hey, don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a little comment, even emoji, to let me know you're here. Now, let your body relax. Lie down on your bed. Turn off the lights. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath in, and gently let it out. Let go of the day. Let go of all thoughts. Just be here with me in this quiet moment. And as we begin tonight's journey into history, let your mind drift. Let your body rest. And slowly, gently, fall asleep with the story. Hello everyone. Tonight, we explore a story, not of thunderous triumphs or the glare of a crown, but of quiet shadows and an unexpected ascent. It is the whispered tale of Claudius, the fourth emperor of Rome, whose path was paved not with ambition, but with the gentle turning of fate's wheel. Imagine, if you will, the ancient city breathing softly under a velvet sky, as we drift back to an era when destiny chose a scholar, weaving his quiet wisdom into the very fabric of an empire. Let the echoes of his journey lull you into a peaceful slumber, as we trace the delicate threads of his life. In the cool hush of late summer, beneath the wide porticos of the Palatine Hill, a child was born into one of the most powerful bloodlines in the world, Tiberius Claudius Drusus, grandson of Livia Drusilla, wife of Emperor Augustus, and scion of the great Claudian family. His mother, Antonia Minor, was daughter of Mark Antony and niece to Augustus himself. His father, Drusus the Elder, was a celebrated general, loved by legions and poets alike. But none of this glory would reach young Claudius, at least, not yet. He came into the world in 10 BCE, in Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, France, during one of his father's campaigns. Even at birth, Claudius was seen as something of a disappointment. His limbs trembled, his tongue stumbled, his head tilted strangely. They called it a curse, a weakness. The child, who should have been a prince, was cloaked in whispers. His mother never showed warmth. A creature more of nature than nurture, she was rumored to have said. His grandmother, Livia, powerful, cold, and calculating, barely acknowledged him. And yet, the marble halls of their estate bore witness to his small footsteps echoing in solitude. Nurses hushed each other when he passed, unsure whether to pity or ignore him. But Claudius listened. In those quiet corridors and shaded gardens, he became a silent observer. While his cousins played the games of power and mock triumph, Claudius watched the slaves' routines, the changing moods of senators, and the slow movements of time. He listened to the cadence of Latin and Greek, and the way people's voices changed when they lied. And so, he was forgotten, but he remembered everything. As seasons passed over the rooftops of Rome, young Claudius remained cloaked in the soft fog of neglect. While the empire grew bold under Augustus's golden reign, and Tiberius marched through provinces with steel and fire, Claudius wandered the gardens of his family estates uninvited, unseen, and untested. His limp made others turn their gaze. His stutter made their laughter sharper. But behind those perceived flaws, a secret empire was forming, an empire of the mind. While other boys wrestled or practiced oratory, Claudius was drawn to the musty scent of old scrolls. He lingered in the corners of the family library, a chamber few nobles visited unless required. There, dust danced in beams of sunlight, and the words of Livy, Varro, and Homer whispered to him like friends. He memorized histories line by line, spoke to statues as if they were tutors, and found refuge in ancient tongues and forgotten kings. His first tutor, Titus Livius, Livy himself, recognized a rare spark in the boy's eyes. He told Antonia, "He is not slow. He sees everything, just does not rush to speak it." But Antonia, bitter and disappointed, dismissed the praise. She insisted on harsh discipline, hoping to beat the awkwardness out of him. His body bore the bruises of tutor's rods, but his spirit remained untouched. Still, the child found solace in rhythm of language, of memory, of ritual. He became fascinated with Etruscan history, their omens, their lost kingdoms. While his cousin Germanicus led games and mock campaigns, Claudius recreated battles in ink. He designed imaginary temples and wrote speeches no one would hear. When questioned, he could recite the lineage of emperors and kings without flaw, but he often stumbled when trying to greet his own relatives. And so, he was mocked. His cousin Caligula, with a cruel grin, called him a monster. The servants whispered about omens and curses. But the scrolls, the statues, and the silent gods of history whispered otherwise. In time, the shadows became his companions. They did not ask him to speak quickly, nor walk straight, nor laugh on cue. They simply allowed him to be. As Claudius passed into adolescence, his world remained that of a shadowed observer. But now, his mind began to glow like coals waiting for flame. Still mocked, still limping, still slow of speech yet within him, a quiet strength was beginning to gather. He watched the politics of Rome swirl around him like a great storm. The careful posturing of the Senate, the invisible games of Livia, the arrogance of the Julian heirs. The empire, proud and mighty, had no place for the boy with the bent legs and broken voice. And so, Claudius did not ask for one. Instead, he deepened his knowledge. His days were spent in parchment and silence, reading forgotten histories, documenting obscure legal customs, writing commentaries few would read. He began composing a history of the Etruscans, later one of Carthage's subjects the Roman elite dismissed as irrelevant. He felt a kinship with these lost nations, fallen powers overshadowed by the mighty. Perhaps he saw himself in them. But he was not blind to his humiliation. When his family hosted festivals and banquets, Claudius was often kept from public view. Germanicus, tall and beloved, would enter like a golden hero, while Claudius remained near the kitchen doors. At public events, he was laughed at. In private, his own mother wrote, "He is a fool, a disgrace to the family name." Even slaves learned they could speak freely in his presence. No one expected him to repeat it with authority. Still, he learned. He listened. He recorded. He developed a deep fascination with law and governance, often questioning why Rome operated the way it did. He kept notice tucked behind scrolls, beneath floor tiles in corruption, succession, titles, and taxes. His room became a chamber of scrolls and silence, where he could outthink the very men who mocked him. By the end of his teenage years, Claudius was already fluent in Latin, Greek, and Etruscan. His body remained weak, but his mind was growing formidable. He no longer cried when they laughed. He simply remembered who laughed and when. The world did not yet know him, but he had begun to know the world. In his early 20s, Claudius remained what many called him in jest, the family embarrassment. His cousin Germanicus had risen high in the ranks, commanding legions, walking beside emperors. The young Caligula, charming and unpredictable, dazzled the court. Claudius, meanwhile, wandered the villas of Capua, Tibur, and Rome, escorted more by tutors than by guards, more often in libraries than in forums. And yet, behind the curtain of mockery, the real education of Claudius was reaching its peak. The great historians of the empire, Aulus Cremutius Cordus, Asinius Pollio, and others had left behind scrolls he devoured like bread. His studies were no longer passive. He now critiqued them, challenged them, rewrote them. His curiosity had no limit. He analyzed the faults of past rulers, questioned the role of the Senate, traced how laws were written and broken. He noticed patterns show history repeated, how mistakes echoed. With no political future expected of him, he was free to study what others ignored. He wrote of Etruscan religion, Greek philosophy, and even Roman grammar, finding structure in the mechanics of language that others found tedious. His treatise on dice playing, yes, even gambling, was written in such detail that it amused even those who mocked him. To Claudius, nothing was beneath examination. He lived quietly in the villa of Antonia, his mother, who tolerated his presence but rarely welcomed him. She refused to allow him into imperial councils, and he was often denied entry to noble ceremonies. "Let the idiot write," she once told a senator. But Claudius did not fight this exile, he used it. He took long walks alone, observing how Rome's citizens moved, how the guards shifted at nightfall, how slaves repeated orders without question. He noticed which fountains dried in summer, which voices rose in the Senate, and how the gossip of the Suburra echoed the whispers of the palace. He began to understand the mechanics of Rome's living body. While others rose in battle and blood, Claudius rose in knowledge. It was a climb no one could see, quiet, slow, and unstoppable. The Roman Empire, proud and gold-veined, had begun to twitch beneath its surface. The death of Augustus had passed with solemn splendor, and Tiberius, cold as marble, now held the throne. In the Palatine Palace, shadows grew longer. Whispers curled behind every drape. And somewhere beneath the colonnades of power, Claudius watched, listened, and remembered. He was still mocked, still excluded from imperial councils. Tiberius, distant and brooding, barely acknowledged him. But that suited Claudius. In silence, he saw the unspoken truths. He saw the sly rise of Sejanus, the Praetorian commander who wrapped his ambition in loyalty. He saw how Livia's whispers still carried weight, even after her death. He noted every nod and glance that passed through marble halls, and while others moved to seize advantage, Claudius moved only with ink. When Sejanus orchestrated his treachery-sexilling rivals, arranging poison in goblets, Claudius was far from the court, writing his treatise on the history of the Roman alphabet. Yet he noticed how names disappeared from public records, how statues were removed in the night, how the Senate began to tremble even when Tiberius was silent. He learned from that fear. He studied not only history, but the psychology of empire. Why did men betray? Why did they obey? What made a tyrant? What made a martyr? His thoughts became darker, deeper, less academic. He no longer studied Rome as an ideal. He began to understand Rome as it was, a theater of masks and knives. Through all this, Claudius remained untouched. The world saw no threat in the man with the stammer. Senators laughed behind their hands. Courtiers avoided eye contact. But among the people, among scribes, freedmen, and servantry, began to earn quiet respect. He remembered names. He asked questions. He quoted poets to illiterate guards. He also began corresponding with scholars across the provinces. Alexandria, Carthage, even distant Pergamon. His letters, written in flawless Greek and increasingly refined Latin, showed a curiosity for law, customs, and culture far beyond Rome. He became, unofficially, one of the greatest intellectuals of his time. Still, he was alone. No lover shared his bed. No senator offered friendship. His own family thought him a joke, but that solitude, long and painful, had become his forge. While the empire quivered, Claudius grew into a man the empire could not yet see. In the quiet corners of his villa, while Rome schemed and burned, Claudius stayed awake long after the city slept. Oil lamps glowed on cracked mosaic floors. Scrolls lay unfurled like wings. And somewhere between ink and silence, Claudius began to understand power not just as conquest, but as story. He had now written several volumes, histories of the civil wars, a biography of Augustus, a treatise on Etruscan religious rites, and even a complex essay on punctuation in Latin speech. Few read them. Fewer still praised them. But they were his legacy in waiting, pieces of a mind the empire had cast aside. What he did not yet know was that his words were being watched. A freedman named Narcissus, himself once mocked for his status, had begun to copy Claudius's scrolls for private distribution. These scrolls made their way through scholarly circles, even into libraries frequented by senators. They stirred quiet admiration. "The fool writes like a philosopher," one consul whispered. "Better than Cicero, some say," another murmured. But no one dared say it too loud. Not yet. And still, Claudius lived apart. He aged without notice. He dined in silence. His clothes were modest. His posture stooped. Yet within, he had become sharp as obsidian. Then came a turning. Sejanus fell. The traitor's ambitions were uncovered, and Rome gasped as Tiberius crushed him with sudden fury. Executions followed. Allies vanished. Statues were toppled in the Forum. And in this purge, Claudius Once beneath notice was now eyed with mild curiosity. He had no ties to Sejanus, no ambitions, and that made him, paradoxically, clean. The emperor's paranoia deepened, but Claudius was untouched. In fact, Tiberius's final letters even named Claudius as a man of quiet merit. It was not praise, not quite, but it was the first time in years Claudius's name was spoken with something close to respect. He took no satisfaction in Sejanus's fall. Rather, he watched in somber recognition. Rome was devouring itself again, just as it had under Sulla, under Caesar. His histories were no longer distant lessons. They had become warnings. But there were still small joys. He had begun to mentor a few young minds, among them Pallas, another freedman whose loyalty would echo through Claudius's future. And on occasion, when the air was soft and the moon high, Claudius would walk to the edge of his garden and murmur his own poetry aloud. Rome had not asked for his voice, but in the silence, it had begun to listen. Claudius was nearly 40 when he first married. By Roman standards, this was almost an admission of failure. In a city that prized dynasty, sons, and strong heirs, he had delayed too long. Or perhaps, more truthfully, the world had delayed him, seeing no reason to marry off a man who stammered, limped, and seemed so far from glory. His first bride was Plautia Urgulanilla, of noble Sabine blood and the granddaughter of Urgulania, a close friend of Livia herself. The marriage was not born of love, but arrangement. Yet Claudius, ever hopeful, believed it might grow into affection. For a while, they found peace. In the cool courtyards of his villa, he read poetry aloud. She listened sometimes. They shared silences more than words. Soon, she bore him a son, Drusus Claudius. For Claudius, it was a moment of quiet triumph. He held the infant in his trembling hands and whispered verses from Virgil, dreaming perhaps of a future not so empty. But fate, so often cruel to him, intervened. The child died young, before he could speak a word. Then, the truth of Urgulanilla began to show its cracks. Whispers reached Claudius of affairs, of arrogance, of cruelty to their household slaves. Worse still, her family became entangled in a murder. She was implicated in the scandalous death of her own sister-in-law. Claudius, despite his aching heart, divorced her. It was not revenge. It was sorrow wrapped in necessity. He then married Aelia Paetina, a woman of modest temperament and gentler spirit. With her, Claudius had a daughter, Claudia Antonia. He smiled more often in those years. But still, there was a gulf, the kind that intellect cannot cross. Aelia found no joy in scrolls or histories. She resented his long absences in libraries, and his growing fondness for his freedmen companions. They drifted, quietly, without storm. He divorced her, two more out of duty than fury. Between marriages, Claudius filled his days with letters and gardens. He walked alone under flowering pergolas, often dictating thoughts on love, on law, on legacy to his scribe. He studied ancient Sabine marriage rites, as if understanding them might repair his own heart. But he remained lonely, craving not just affection, but recognition, someone who saw more than the surface. And then, one evening, he met Valeria Messalina. She was young, beautiful, noble. She spoke softly, with clever restraint. Claudius, older now and heavy with the years of waiting, thought perhaps finally he was seen. But the empire had long learned. Beauty in Rome was rarely innocent. She entered like a whisper, Valeria Messalina, cousin to the imperial bloodline, daughter of Domitia Lepida. Her beauty, said the poets, made even statues weep. Her voice was silk, her walk poetry. But her eyes held a hunger that did not sleep. Claudius, nearing 50, was tired of loneliness. Messalina was barely 15. Yet the marriage was celebrated swiftly. It was politically perfect. She was of noble lineage and bore the name of Augustus through her mother's side. For Claudius, who had been overlooked for so long, her acceptance felt like sunlight after endless shadow. At first, there was warmth. They dined together under the colonnades of his villa, laughing over Greek plays and light wines. Messalina praised his knowledge. She touched his arm gently as he spoke. When she gave birth to a son, Tiberius Claudius Britannicus, Claudius was overcome. He named the boy after the empire, after the line of emperors. It seemed a new dynasty had truly begun. But Rome is a place where masks thrive. Behind the silken veils, Messalina spun webs. She grew bold, insatiable. She took lovers without shame, senators, actors, even slaves. She built a secret villa in the gardens of Lucullus, where hidden chambers echoed with illicit games. Freedmen whispered warnings. Friends hinted at disgrace. But Claudius, so often blind to treachery in his personal life, refused to believe them. Perhaps he feared heartbreak more than humiliation. Her power grew. She arranged marriages, brokered alliances, and ordered executions all in his name. When Claudius appointed her cousin Faustus Sulla to the consulship, it was at her whisper. Even the praetorians bowed before her, for they saw in her something terrifyingly certain, ambition wrapped in silk. One day, she did the unthinkable. While Claudius was away in Ostia, Messalina married another man, Gaius Silius, a handsome and ambitious noble. The ceremony was grand, celebrated as though Claudius were dead. Some said she meant to seize the empire itself. When the news reached Claudius, he stood silent. Then he trembled. Then, for the first time, he roared. It was his freedman Narcissus especially who acted swiftly. Silius was executed. Messalina fled to the gardens, barefoot, weeping. She begged the praetorian commander for mercy. But Claudius sent no word. She was put to death in silence, without trial, beneath a moonless sky. Claudius never spoke her name again. The air in Rome never stayed still for long. No sooner had Messalina's ashes cooled than the Senate murmured of succession, and whispers curled like smoke in marble halls. Claudius, ever practical, knew the empire needed an empress, and his son, Britannicus, needed a mother. But Rome did not offer him quiet hearts. It offered Agrippina the younger. She was daughter of Germanicus, Claudius's own heroic brother and sister to Caligula. Her blood was imperial, her will, iron beneath silk. She had already buried one husband, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, and her young son, Lucius Domitius, was rumored to possess a terrible, dark brilliance. Agrippina entered Claudius's life with grace cloaked in ambition. She wept before him, spoke of family, of healing, of Rome's need for stability. And Claudius, weary, aging, and perhaps desperate for harmony, married her. It was a union of blood and calculation. Agrippina's first act was the elevation of her son. Lucius was adopted by Claudius and given a new name, Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. She secured his engagement to Claudius's daughter, Octavia, merging bloodlines like threads of a tapestry woven with force. At first, Claudius admired her discipline. Rome settled under her sharp eye. She swept away rivals, reorganized the palace, and restored the dignity that Messalina had shattered. But beneath her grace, he began to feel the bite of cold control. His own son, Britannicus, grew distant, watched, corrected, moved quietly from sight. By the year 54 AD, Claudius, now silver-haired, his steps slower, seemed to awaken. "I have made Nero my son," he once muttered to a friend, "but he shall taste the lash." It was a murmur of regret, too late. That autumn, after a feast in the imperial palace, Claudius fell ill. Some said it was mushrooms, a favorite delicacy of his. Others whispered of poison hidden beneath their softness. And others still named Locusta, Rome's infamous poisoner, said to have worked at Agrippina's order. He died slowly, slipping between fever and silence. Agrippina forbade all visitors. She claimed he was resting. By dawn, the emperor was gone. His final words are lost to time if he spoke at all. Agrippina had already arranged the next dawn's events. Nero, now 16, was named emperor before the ashes of Claudius were even cooled. Britannicus watched silent, sidelined. Claudius, who had once been mocked as a fool, had become Rome's master, and now its ghost. Rome had bathed in blood. The year was 41 AD, and the mad emperor, Caligula, was dead, cut down by his own guard in a corridor echoing with betrayal. His wife, slain. His child, dashed upon the palace stones. And in the silence that followed, the empire held its breath. In that silence, someone was found hiding behind a curtain. He was 50 years old. His knees trembled. His tongue stammered. His cloak was stained with fear. His name was Tiberius Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, uncle to the slain Caligula, son of the heroic Germanicus, grandson of Mark Antony. And yet, until that day, he had lived as a laughingstock. Historians called him limp, slow of speech, with a stammer and a twitch, a man better suited to scrolls than power. A man who had never commanded an army, never held true political power. But history does not always choose the bold. Sometimes it chooses the overlooked. The Praetorian Guard found him trembling behind a curtain. Legend says he fell to his knees. They laughed at first, but then someone saw the bloodline in his eyes, the lineage of Augustus, the wisdom of a man who had watched and listened while others screamed. They lifted him to his feet and hailed him emperor. The Senate was stunned. Some sneered, others protested. "A fool, a puppet," they cried. But Claudius, with sudden clarity, acted. He rewarded the Praetorians handsomely, securing their loyalty. He addressed the Senate not with fear, but with icy patience. "I have always served Rome," he told them. "Now I will protect her." He ordered a purge of those who plotted further chaos. He appointed new administrators, men chosen for merit, not noble birth. He surrounded himself with freedmen. Narcissus, clever and ruthless. Pallas, a man of quiet ambition. And Callistus, whose eyes missed nothing. These were not patricians, they were survivors, like Claudius himself. It was not a glamorous ascent. It was not chosen by the people. But it was real. And in the weeks that followed, Claudius surprised everyone. He held court with calm precision. He studied cases himself. He reformed the courts, expanded the Senate with provincial men, and reined in corrupt officials. He did not rule with spectacle. He ruled with steady hands and sleepless nights. And yet, beneath the calm, he never forgot that curtain. He never forgot that fear. And he would never again let Rome see him falter. The Senate had long considered itself the heart of Rome, but in Claudius it found an emperor who looked elsewhere for strength. They saw him as weak, as a placeholder, a tool to be steered. What they did not see, until too late, was the iron beneath his scholar's robes. In his early months as emperor, Claudius chose silence over spectacle. He studied, recorded, and listened. He wrote down names, those who had mocked him, those who had plotted, those who still smiled too quickly when they said Caesar. Then, quietly, he began to act. Lucius Vitellius, a seasoned senator and one of his rare allies in the Curia, became a shield in politics. Through him, Claudius navigated the web of the old nobility. But true power came not from noble houses, it came from those whom the Senate scorned, his freedmen. There was Narcissus, former slave-turned-palace secretary, with a tongue sharp as glass. It was Narcissus who exposed the plotters who sought to use Claudius as a puppet. With forged letters and swift daggers, he ensured loyalty where it faltered. Then came Pallas, tall, watchful, almost invisible in his movements, yet master of the treasury. He modernized Rome's finances, balanced the imperial accounts, and quietly punished those who siphoned gold. Finally, Callistus, the old Greek, whose past was veiled but whose reach touched every court case, every whisper in every villa. Together, they formed a new backbone of power not born of nobility, but of survival. The Senate fumed, but the people began to murmur Claudius's name with cautious respect. He restored order to the courts, sitting in judgment himself, day after day. listening to commoners and patricians alike. He declared that no citizen, however humble, would be ignored. He reopened harbor projects, repaired aqueducts, and passed laws that punished corruption with exile, not gold. He extended citizenship to the provinces, especially Gaul, and allowed their nobles to sit in the Senate. "Let Rome be ruled not by blood," he said, "but by worth." And though his speech was still marked by a stammer, his words now echoed across marble halls. He built his empire not on charm or legacy, but on reform, rule, and resolve. Still, danger never slipped. He survived several conspiracies, most notably the plot led by Scribonianus, governor of Dalmatia. The man raised a legion and declared rebellion, thinking Claudius too weak to stop him. But the legion stayed loyal. Scribonianus's own troops deserted him. He took his life beside the Adriatic Sea. Claudius watched Rome breathe again. For the first time, his rule was not a joke. But he slept lightly. For in Rome, daggers were always waiting beneath the laurel. Now Claudius stood not as placeholder or pawn, but as emperor by law, by blood, by choice. It was a throne he never sought, and yet it fit him. To rule Rome was not to shout or to swagger, it was to carry an ocean in silence. And Claudius, in his quiet way, became a master of currents. By 42 AD, he had stabilized the empire after Caligula's chaos. But Rome was not built on stillness. It demanded expansion, control, and spectacle. And so Claudius, the man mocked for frailty, did what many doubted he could. He took Rome to war. The target was Britannia, a land of fog, oak, and resistance. Julius Caesar had touched its shores a century before, but never claimed it. Now, Claudius sent 4 legions, led by the general Aulus Plautius, to cross the sea. They met fierce resistance, but Rome pushed forward. Then, in a theatrical stroke, Claudius himself arrived in full imperial regalia and marched into Camulodunum, modern Colchester. There, he accepted the submission of the British tribes and returned to Rome triumphant, hailed as imperator. The Senate erected a triumphal arch, and the people rejoiced. This was no longer the stammering uncle. This was a Caesar who had won a kingdom. Back home, he deepened his legacy through monumental works. He completed the Aqua Claudia, a mighty aqueduct that brought clean water to Rome. He restored the port of Ostia, building artificial harbors and grain warehouses to secure food for the capital. He constructed new roads across the province's veins of empire stretching into Gaul, Illyria, and Syria. He also penned histories in Greek and Latin, detailing Etruscan religion and Carthaginian wars. Though lost to time, these works showed a ruler who wrote the world even as he ruled it. And yet, for all his triumphs, Claudius remained a man of caution. He still feared assassins in silence, still trusted his freedmen over senators, and still carried the trauma of ridicule like a hidden scar beneath his imperial cloak. In his personal life, too, he sought stability. He had married Valeria Messalina, a noblewoman of great beauty and growing ambition. At first, she was charming, playful, the mother of his son Britannicus. But slowly, she grew darker. She manipulated court politics, arranged executions, and surrounded herself with dangerous allies. Claudius loved her, or tried to, but love, in the palace, was a dangerous illusion. And while Claudius built aqueducts and armies, Messalina built her own empire of whispers. The stage was set. Claudius had risen, but the storm behind his eyes had not yet passed. The palace of Claudius stood high on the Palatine Hill, its gardens lush, its pillars wrapped in vine and rose, but beneath the scent of jasmine grew rot. Messalina, once the emperor's beloved, now bloomed with ambition that knew no bounds. At first, the empire had praised her young, radiant mother to Britannicus. She attended festivals with a noble's grace, offered grain to temples, and bore herself with all the humility of a true Roman matron. But power changed her, as the throne had changed Claudius. She gathered lovers as others gathered coins. Her eyes were not satisfied with titles, she wanted control. Claudius, ever the scholar, was slow to see. He spent long hours in judgment courts, reviewing tax laws, inspecting aqueduct drafts, reading lost Etruscan tomes. And while he ruled Rome by daylight, Messalina ruled the shadows. Her influence grew unchecked. She appointed governors, manipulated trials, and even arranged executions, all without the emperor's consent. She whispered into ears of senators, seduced poets, bribed slaves. It was Narcissus, Claudius's freedman and secretary, who first warned him. "My Caesar," he whispered one twilight, "the lioness has grown teeth." Claudius blinked, uncertain. "She is my wife, the mother of my son." But even he, in his wisdom, had begun to notice her distance, the way she laughed too freely, left court before dusk, returned with excuses laced in perfume. Then came the moment that shattered illusion. Messalina had not simply taken lovers, she had married one. In secret, in a garden of spring flowers, while Claudius yet lived and ruled, Messalina wed Gaius Silius, a handsome senator and rising political star. It was not just betrayal. It was treason. Rome gasped. The court trembled. It was said she believed Claudius would not survive the disgrace, that the guards would declare Silius emperor and raise his banner before the night was over. But Claudius did not fall. His freedmen, led by Narcissus, acted swiftly. They shielded the emperor, locked down the palace, and summoned the Praetorian Guard. Claudius, stunned but resolute, gave a single nod. "Let her be removed, quietly. I do not wish to see her." Messalina fled to the gardens of Lucullus, where she wept beneath olive trees. She begged for mercy, but Narcissus, fearing hesitation, sent soldiers. They found her shaking, clutching a dagger she could not use. A centurion took the blade and ended her life. Claudius said nothing. He ate his dinner that night without a word. And when the Senate asked what should be written of Messalina, he replied, "Let nothing be remembered." After Messalina's fall, the halls of the Palatine no longer laughed so easily. Claudius, once mild in judgment, now moved through his days with a quiet steel beneath his robes. The court watched him closely. They had expected him to grieve, and he had, but silently, alone, in the garden where no eyes could follow. There, under a fading olive tree, he had once whispered her name. But that softness did not return with him. "Let all who would test me be warned," he said before the Senate weeks later. And so began Claudius's second phase, the ruler who would forgive no treason twice. He turned to those he trusted most, not patricians, not senators, but freedmen, former slaves who had proven loyalty beyond blood. Narcissus, his chief secretary, became the unseen architect of palace operations. Pallas, the treasurer, helped reform taxation and audit corrupted estates. Callistus, his legal advisor, ensured swift punishment to those who dared conspire. Through them, Claudius began to root out plots in the Senate, eliminate governors grown too powerful, and quietly exile or execute former allies of Messalina. Some called it paranoia. Others called it survival. He restructured laws with precision, punishing false accusations, revoking senatorial immunity, and enforcing strict trials, all recorded in his meticulous hand. Meanwhile, the question of succession loomed. Messalina's son, Britannicus, was still young. The empire needed stability, and Rome needed a new empress. Claudius, cautious now, let his advisors seek a wife. And they returned with Agrippina, the younger daughter of Germanicus, sister of Caligula, and widow of a noble. She was imperial by blood, and sharp as any senator. Claudius saw in her a match of intellect, dignity, and lineage. He married her in 49 AD, a union that shocked many. Roman law forbade uncles from marrying nieces, but Claudius had the law rewritten. And with Agrippina came her son Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, later renamed Nero. Agrippina was brilliant and poised, but behind her soft voice was steel. She wanted the throne for her son, not Britannicus, and she would stop at nothing. Claudius saw the brewing storm, but he also saw peace. She brought unity to the court. She rebuilt palaces, restored temples, and honored the memory of Augustus. And so, for a moment, things quieted. But beneath the mosaics and marbled smiles, ambition stirred once more. Claudius, wise as he was, still believed in order, in law, in family. But the empire, like his palace, was full of open doors and shadowed corners. And the footsteps of betrayal had not left Rome. In the final years of his middle reign, Claudius seemed slower. Not in mind, no. His intellect remained sharp, as did his passion for languages, law, and history. But his steps had softened, and his gaze often turned inward, toward the deeper corridors of thought and memory. He spent his mornings in the Bibliotheca Palatina, surrounded by scrolls and stone busts of emperors past. There, beneath murals of Romulus and Remus, he pondered what sort of Rome he would leave behind. 2 sons, but only one would wear the purple. Britannicus, blood of Claudius and Messalina, was nearing manhood, quiet, observant, and dignified. Nero, son of Agrippina, had grown swift of tongue, charming of voice, and was already beloved by the people. With Agrippina guiding him, he seemed inevitable. Claudius had once declared Britannicus his heir. But now, under Agrippina's influence, he had adopted Nero, granted him the title of Prince of Youth, and arranged for him to marry Octavia, Claudius's own daughter. Was it foresight? Weakness? Love? Fear? The Senate applauded. The people cheered. But inside the palace, voices began to fall quiet when Claudius passed. He noticed how Agrippina lingered longer at the Praetorian barracks. How Nero began to speak with senators alone. How even Narcissus now hesitated before delivering news. One evening, as a cold rain whispered against the marble colonnades, Claudius turned to Narcissus and said, "I fear I have erred, my friend. I have raised a viper to the heart of Rome." It was said he planned to change his will, to elevate Britannicus once more, to banish Agrippina, to cut short Nero's rise. But fate, or poison, would move faster. In the autumn of 54 AD, during a banquet in the imperial villa at Sinuessa, Claudius ate his favorite mushrooms, a delicacy he adored. That night, he fell ill. The next morning, his voice was gone. His breath labored. Agrippina refused the physician's entry. Only Locusta, a known poisoner favored by Agrippina, was summoned. Within hours, Claudius lay dying. Some say he briefly awoke enough to see Agrippina at his side, whispering soft comforts. Others believe he died in silence, lips moving in prayer, as the empire slipped from his fingers. Claudius died on October 13th, 54 AD, with only a few loyal freedmen and guards present. Britannicus was kept away. Agrippina announced his death calmly to the Senate. Nero was declared emperor the very same day. The year was 43 AD. Claudius sat beneath the marble dome of the Temple of Mars Ultor. Around him, generals whispered of caution, of logistics, of storms across the sea. Yet Claudius, the stammering historian, the reluctant emperor, lifted his hand with quiet resolve. "Send the legions," he said, his voice firm. "Let Rome embrace the Isles." Thus began the campaign that would define his reign, the conquest of Britannia, a prize even Julius Caesar had failed to claim. It was not only for glory. Claudius knew Rome needed victory. His rule had begun in doubt. The Senate still eyed him as a placeholder. The soldiers saw him as fortune's pawn. But conquest could silence them all. Four legions marched north. Legio II Augusta, led by the ambitious future emperor, Vespasian. Legio IX Hispana, known for discipline. Legio XIV Gemina, and 20 Valeria Victrix, veterans of the Rhine. They crossed the Channel under thunderclouds, landing in Kent with Roman discipline and divine omens at their backs. For months, they clashed with native tribes, the Catuvelauni, fierce and proud, led by the warrior brothers Caradicus and Togodumnus. It was not an easy campaign. The forests of Britannia swallowed men and maps alike. rain turned roads to rivers. But slowly, Rome pushed forward. And then, Claudius himself appeared. He arrived by ship not as a warrior, but as an emperor crowned by prophecy. With him came war elephants, unheard of in those lands, and a cohort of Praetorian guards clad in polished bronze. The Britons, stunned by the spectacle, surrendered Camulodunum, modern Colchester, and Claudius accepted their oaths. For this triumph, he was granted the title Imperator and a triumph in Rome, rare for a non-military emperor. He paraded through the city, not in armor, but in civic robes, his son Britannicus at his side. The streets wept laurels, statues were raised, arches carved with his deeds. The Senate, ever cautious, now praised him as a true leader. Yet Claudius, ever the scholar, did not boast. Instead, he returned to his scrolls and to governance. He appointed governors to Britannia, including Aulus Plautius, who would continue the war. He ordered roads, forts, and aqueducts in the new province. He sent scribes to record the local dialects and customs. To him, victory was not in blood, but in the law that followed. In quiet moments, he reflected on what Rome must look like from those distant green hills, and how long such conquest could hold. In the stillness after conquest, Claudius turned inward. To the Senate, he was still something of a curiosity, the boy once hidden for his limp and stammer, now garbed in the purple of Rome's highest office. But to the people, his works began to speak louder than the whispers of old. And so he built. Rome, once buckling under corruption and excess, began to breathe again under the chisel of Claudius's vision. Stone by stone, the empire was reshaped. He commissioned 2 new aqueducts. Aqua Claudia, clear and strong, coursing like silver over ancient hills. Ennio Novis, vast and deep, supplying the ever-growing thirst of the capital. These were not mere feats of engineering, they were lifelines. In public baths, forums, and kitchens, the people blessed the name of Claudius, a rarity for an emperor who had never led a charge, but led all the same. He reformed the legal system, personally judging cases, listening not as a ruler, but as a man of letters. Petitioners traveled from distant provinces to see the emperor who would read their appeals aloud, pausing thoughtfully before ruling with careful precision. He introduced new laws protecting slaves from unjust cruelty, granting freedmen more rights, and extending citizenship to provincial elites. Rome, under his hand, grew not only in land, but in soul. Yet not all praised him. The nobility seethed at his promotion of freedmen like Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, who now held great influence in the palace. They called it corruption. Claudius called it merit. "These men," he once said, "have served me better than those born into pride." And he expanded the Senate, not with old Roman families, but with voices from the provinces, Gaul, Hispania, Africa. It was unheard of. Rome's upper chamber, once the domain of patricians, now heard Celtic accents and African wisdom. Through all of this, Claudius remained devoted to knowledge. He wrote histories of the Etruscans, of Carthage, of the early Republic. He even tried to reform the Latin alphabet, proposing new letters. Some laughed. But for him, language was the empire's true spine. Amid his writings, one phrase recurred often: "Let the empire be worthy of its ancestors and its future." At night, he walked the forum, disguised in dark robes, listening to his people, their complaints, their laughter. He studied them like a historian watching a civilization unfold. He had no love for power, only duty, and in that, he became more powerful than any had imagined. As the years passed, Claudius's triumphs rose like marble statues. But so did the burdens they cast in shadow. He had extended Rome's borders, Mauritania in the west, Thracia in the east, and of course Britannia. His generals returned with spoils, captives, and songs. But every victory brought new governors, new betrayals, new ambition. The empire had grown vast, and its seams began to strain. Within the palace, the air thickened. His trusted freedmen Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus now wielded influence feared by the Senate. Their wealth swelled. Their names were whispered in envy. Even Claudius's judgments began to carry their fingerprints, subtle and unseen. But it was love that would shape his downfall. After the execution of Messalina, Claudius, still grieving, still uncertain, was convinced to marry again. The Senate, seeking calm, supported it, and so he wed Agrippina the Younger, his niece. She was beautiful, intelligent, calculating. She brought her son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, whom Claudius adopted, renaming him Nero. And slowly, the careful order Claudius had constructed began to tilt. Agrippina charmed the palace. She removed rivals. She cast long looks over the empire, her eyes resting on the boy by her side. Claudius, blind or weary, allowed it. He granted Nero early honors. He placed him above his own son, Britannicus. Senators watched in silence. The people whispered, would the emperor live to see his heir rule? Even Claudius began to wonder. In a moment of clarity, he is said to have remarked, I have given power to my own destruction. But it was too late. In 54 AD, as autumn leaves fell over the Tiber, Claudius grew ill after a banquet. It was said to be mushrooms, a delicacy he loved, but they were poisoned. Some whispered Agrippina had prepared them herself. Others claimed Locusta, the infamous poisoner, had crafted the brew. Claudius suffered in silence. Narcissus tried to intervene too late. The emperor died in the palace, surrounded not by soldiers or scholars, but by quiet betrayal. Agrippina announced his death the next morning. Nero ascended. The Senate mourned. Statues were draped. His ashes placed in the mausoleum of Augustus, beside the emperors he had once studied in dusty scrolls. Rome wept and moved on. But Claudius, awkward, reluctant, wise, had shaped its heart in ways few would grasp for generations. The marble of Rome, so solid, so eternal, held secrets behind its walls. Claudius, for all his reforms and justice, knew this. He had read history, he had written it, and he understood. The greatest danger to an emperor was not revolt in distant provinces, but poison in his cup or a false smile across a dinner table. He had lived through the madness of Caligula, the deceit of Tiberius, and the paranoia of Sejanus. He had seen emperors die not by blade, but by betrayal. So when he took the throne, Claudius surrounded himself with those he trusted, not by blood, but by deed. Enter his freedmen, Narcissus, head of correspondence, Pallas, the treasurer, Callistus, master of petitions, former slaves, once invisible, now gatekeepers of empire. They knew how to listen, more importantly, how to watch. Through their ears, Claudius ruled, and through their eyes, he saw the dangers gathering. Plots emerged like weeds in spring. The nobility resented their loss of influence. The Senate, humiliated by Claudius's independence, quietly nurtured dissent. Some even whispered of returning to a republic. Claudius responded not with fire, but with files. He kept records, letters, confession. Every conspiracy that arose from Gaius Silanus, governor of Asia, to Lucius Aruntius Camillus Scribonianus of Dalmatia, was swiftly documented, judged, and extinguished. When Scribonianus revolted in 42 AD, declaring Claudius unfit, the emperor did not ride to battle. Instead, he waited. Within 5 days, the rebellion collapsed. Soldiers refused to follow a man without legitimacy. Claudius, they saw, was not the madman they expected, but a steady hand. But peace never lingered. His marriage to Messalina brought deeper danger. She was young, ambitious, and utterly without restraint. She manipulated court appointments, amassed property, and engaged in a scandalous number of affairs. But it was her final betrayal that nearly shattered Claudius. In a secret ceremony, she married Gaius Silius, a nobleman of high standing, while Claudius was still alive. Whether she intended to replace him is still debated by historians. But to Claudius, it was treason. Narcissus, loyal and unblinking, exposed the plot. Claudius returned from Ostia, stunned but composed. He ordered her death, not with anger, but with sorrow. He is said to have dined calmly that night, whispering, "Let her be gone, I must eat." But something shifted in him. He became more cautious, more removed. He trusted few, he smiled less. Rome had taught him, love was fragile, but power more so. Claudius walked the marbled corridors of power like a scholar in a colosseum of lions. The death of Messalina had brought him relief, yes, but also a vast silence. The laughter she once filled the halls with had vanished, replaced by cautious footsteps and half-whispered greetings. His freedmen remained loyal. Narcissus sharpened the state like a blade. Pallas guarded the treasury with unwavering gaze. But even these men, whom Claudius had raised from obscurity, began to gather their own followings. Influence became a currency, and Rome was ever hungry. The Senate, wounded by years of irrelevance, started murmuring again. Some feared Claudius's reliance on freedmen, others feared his isolation, and all feared the boy he adopted next. Nero. With Messalina gone, Claudius remarried. His choice stunned Rome. Agrippina the Younger, daughter of Germanicus, sister of Caligula, mother of Nero. It was a bold move, even controversial. She was his niece. But Claudius saw stability in her lineage. A Julian by blood, an empress by ambition, and Agrippina knew how to play the game. She cleared the palace of rivals. She forged alliances with senators. She even reconciled with Pallas, winning his favor and influence. Then, she persuaded Claudius to adopt Nero, giving the boy not only name, but title, heir. Britannicus, Claudius's own son, was still young, still under tutelage. The adoption, many said, was treason by another name. Whispers grew louder. Claudius's nights became longer. He wandered the palace gardens in the dark, speaking to the statues of his ancestors. He questioned his decisions aloud, fearing he had created another Caligula. He ordered Britannicus to be raised with caution and Nero to be educated in the Stoic virtues, but Claudius knew too well that virtue was no match for ambition. The empire was now full of masks. He once said, "I have become surrounded, not by people, but by intentions." Even the marble around him seemed to lean in, listening. And Claudius, the forgotten boy who once studied shadows, now stood in their center alone, but never unwatched. He had ruled for 13 years. A man once mocked for his stammer, his limp, his nervous tics, now the emperor of the Roman world. He had conquered Britannia, passed laws that strengthened the courts, expanded citizenship, and restored provinces torn by neglect. And yet, the palace walls whispered of his end. The danger was not from the borders of the empire. It came from his own table. Agrippina, ever watchful, had secured Nero's position. Britannicus, once the true heir, was now an obstacle. And Claudius, aging, careful, still naive in love, became expendable. It is said he grew suspicious in his final year. He began speaking warmly again of Britannicus, hinting that the boy might soon come of age. He talked of revising his will. There were rumors of plans to elevate Britannicus formally, perhaps even displace Nero. Agrippina could not allow it. She arranged a dinner. It was simple, a modest affair at the palace in Sublacensis. The chef prepared his usual favorites, but one dish, a bowl of mushrooms, was treated differently. Locusta, a famed poisoner in Rome, had been summoned. She used a compound so subtle it would imitate natural illness, slowing the pulse, dimming the breath, clouding the mind. When Claudius took his final bite, he felt only a curious numbness. And then the trembling began. He collapsed quietly in his chambers that night. Some say he cried out. Others say he slipped away in silence. When the physician Xenophon was called, he did not help. In fact, he may have hastened the end, placing a feather down the emperor's throat and smearing poison upon it, ensuring no recovery. Agrippina stood beside him. When the final breath came, the room was quiet. Outside, torches burned in the misty Roman morning. Nero was proclaimed emperor before dawn. Britannicus was still asleep. Claudius, the forgotten child of the Julio-Claudians, who had risen from ridicule to reign, was gone. But not without leaving echoes. His reforms survived. His written histories, now mostly lost, once guided scribes and governors alike. He expanded the empire's reach and stabilized its laws. He left behind roads, aqueducts, and stories. And in time, the people remembered not the poison but the quiet dignity of his rule. Rome did not expect Claudius to build an empire. They expected him to survive, and perhaps, to stumble. But what he gave them, in the quiet years that followed Messalina's fall, was nothing short of a golden administration. Claudius governed like a man who had studied every mistake made before him, because he had. While others sought glory in conquest or spectacle, he found it in the function of empire: aqueducts, roads, laws, and letters. He was not a general by nature, but a builder by instinct. And he built. The Aqua Claudia and the Anio Novus, two mighty aqueducts, were completed under his rule, stretching across stone arches like veins, feeding the thirsty heart of the city. He expanded the port of Ostia, constructing Portus, a vast artificial harbor that tamed the sea's unpredictability and fed Rome's swelling appetite. He reformed the grain supply, ensuring food reached the poor and riots stayed at bay. He personally oversaw judicial reforms, issuing edicts, shortening trial delays, and sitting in judgment like a scholar king. In his mind, justice was not an ornament, it was infrastructure. His most controversial move? Elevating his freedmen to positions of immense power. Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus, these men, once enslaved, now held portfolios over imperial correspondence, treasury, and petitions. To the nobility, it was scandal. To Claudius, it was logic. Who better to trust, he once said, than those whose rise depends on their merit, not their name. He restructured the imperial bureaucracy, organizing departments like a modern institution, separating civil from military, public from private, Rome from province. The gears of empire turned more smoothly than they had in decades. He expanded Rome's borders not as a conqueror intoxicated by triumph, but as a caretaker reinforcing walls. Britannia was invaded and brought into the Roman fold after a century of resistance. In the east, Judea was stabilized. Mauritania, Lycia, and Thracia were formally annexed and organized under new systems of governance. Each province gained Roman roads, Roman law, Roman coin, and through it all, Claudius wrote tomes on Etruscan religion, on Carthaginian history, on the Latin alphabet. Most are lost now, but their echo survives in footnotes and fragments. He didn't simply rule, he documented his empire as it grew. He revived forgotten festivals, corrected misused rituals, reinforced public morality through example, not edict. Rome prospered not in the firelight of glory, but in the slow, steady rhythm of function and reform. And while others plotted or postured, Claudius worked. He ruled not as the gods might, from lightning and awe, but as a librarian might govern a kingdom, with care, with quiet hands, and with memory. The empire had grown vast, but under Claudius, it became knowable. He believed that governing a people began with understanding them, and so his administration reached further and more intricately than any before. Where generals planted flags, Claudius planted systems. He censused newly annexed provinces, introduced Latin law to cities, established citizenship pathways for provincial elites. For the first time, men born beyond Italy could imagine a future within Rome, not under it. In the east, his emissaries navigated the volatile politics of Armenia and Parthia. In the west, roads snaked deeper into Hispania and Gaul, paved not only with stone, but with tax collectors, scribes, and maps. He built archives, not monuments to ego, but to memory. Claudius believed every edict, every judgment, every name mattered. He personally edited legal reforms, often cross-referencing old republican decrees with new imperial policies. To some, he was meddling. To others, a savior from chaos. He reformed the judiciary, reducing delays and curbing abuses by magistrates. He created specialized courts for different regions and cases. The word justice began to mean more than fear. it began to mean procedure. The provinces felt it. In Lycia, rebellion faded as local leaders were allowed to maintain honor through imperial cooperation. In Britannia, the construction of roads and settlements signaled permanence. Roman baths rose where thatched huts once stood. Trade expanded, and Latin words slipped into native tongues. Even in Judea, long a crucible of unrest, Claudius managed a cautious calm, exiling agitators, yes, but also respecting religious customs more than his predecessors had. He was not a dreamer, he was a record keeper of reality. And reality, under Claudius, was better documented than ever before. The imperial library grew under his eye. He appointed librarians, copyists, catalogers. He corrected corrupted manuscripts and even attempted to reform the Latin alphabet, introducing 3 new letters, though none survived beyond his reign. But it speaks volumes. Where others wrote conquests in blood, Claudius tried to write in ink. He was mocked for it even in his time. Yet historians now understand. Claudius made Rome intelligible. The empire could be mapped, its peoples identified, its laws codified. It could be read. And though his stutter never left him, Rome finally had a ruler who let paper speak louder than parade. The sun over Rome still shone brightly, but within the imperial chambers, shadows began to stretch longer. Time, that old companion of emperors, had turned its face gently away from Claudius. Though the city still echoed with the fountains he had fed and the laws he had shaped, an invisible shift had begun. His golden age, like all golden hours, was preparing to dim. Claudius was aging. His white hair curled thinner above his temples. His steps, once careful but steady, now required the support of loyal hands. Still, he persisted. He continued to sit in judgment, review aqueduct reports, and pen historical treatises with eyes strained by years of scroll-light. He had endured ridicule, survived betrayal, outlived emperors far more brutal than himself, but now his greatest tests would not be from outside. They would come from within. Agrippina, the younger, his 4th wife, had woven herself deep into the fabric of court life. Beautiful, sharp, and descended from Augustus himself, she had married Claudius not for love, but for power, and he had known it. Still, he had admired her ambition. At first. But ambition, once given breath, becomes hunger. Agrippina convinced him to adopt her son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, whom the world would later call Nero. This adoption bypassed Britannicus, Claudius's biological son from Messalina. Britannicus, now a teenager, watched from behind marble pillars as his place at Rome's helm slipped quietly from his grasp. Claudius, ever the historian, saw the irony. He, who had championed merit over blood, was now ensnared in dynastic plots. Whispers grew louder in the palace halls, rumors that Agrippina was shaping Nero's image, teaching him the art of control, the craft of spectacle, the theater of cruelty cloaked in charm. Outside the palace, the people still adored Claudius. Bakers praised him for the grain he secured. Farmers thanked him for the clean irrigation from his aqueducts. Veterans respected his fairness. But none of these could stop the quiet game being played behind silk curtains and beneath jeweled torches. It was a game of legacy and survival. In this fragile hour, Claudius grew more introspective. He often walked alone in the gardens of Livia, his cane tapping softly against stone. He looked not to the past with regret, but to the uncertain future. He had given Rome peace. But would it remain peaceful? He had built an empire of logic. But emotion, vanity, and ambition, these were harder stones to move. The twilight of his reign had begun not with war, but with careful silence, like a fading echo in a vast marble hall. The marble walls of the Palatine whispered now with secrets. The same corridors that had echoed with the laughter of Britannicus and the rhythmic shuffle of Claudius's scholarly steps now carried a different sound. One softer, colder. It was the sound of calculation. Agrippina had always moved with elegance, her sandals making no more noise than falling petals, but now her silences were heavier than speech. She had filled the palace not with friends, but with allies. The freedmen Claudius once trusted Pallas, Narcissus, and Callistus now found their influence dimming. In their place rose flatterers loyal not to the emperor, but to the boy Nero. Claudius was no fool. The signs were clear. His beloved son Britannicus, though true of blood, was being outmaneuvered. Nero had married Claudius's daughter Octavia, intertwining bloodlines. He had received the toga virilis, the man's robe with pomp usually reserved for emperors in waiting. His voice now rang louder in court than Britannicus's quiet honor. Claudius began to regret. He spoke privately with Narcissus, his most faithful secretary. "Perhaps," he murmured one twilight, "I was wrong to trust her. Perhaps it is time Britannicus takes his place." But Rome did not allow for hesitations. And Agrippina, she had no patience for second thoughts. That very week, Claudius fell ill. It began with a light fever, then cramps, then sudden silence during a feast. It was said he had eaten mushrooms, his favorite delicacy served to him by Agrippina herself. Some said she poisoned them. Others whispered that she used a feather dipped in poison, placed gently against his throat while he lay sleeping, too weak to resist. Only a handful were in the room: Agrippina, her physician, and Nero, waiting in the shadows, already rehearsing how to wear the crown. Claudius's final hours were not recorded in glory. There was no grand speech, no final decree, only eyes wide with knowing, only the soft sound of breath fading beneath the veil of midnight. Some say he tried to speak to call for Britannicus, but his tongue, like his empire, had already been stolen. And so, Claudius, the scholar emperor, the builder of aqueducts and restorer of order, died not on a battlefield, but in his own bed, surrounded not by mourning, but by strategy. The next morning, Nero was declared emperor. A golden statue was commissioned. Trumpets sounded. Rome rejoiced. But in the shadows of the palace, Narcissus wept. Time passed gently, like autumn wind across worn stone. Claudius was gone, yet the empire he steadied still pulsed with the rhythm he had shaped. His death had not come with glory, but neither had it come in disgrace. It came like the falling of dusk quiet, inevitable and strangely beautiful. But what remains when an emperor sleeps? The streets of Rome moved on, as they always do. Statues of Claudius remained in corners of basilicas, tucked between columns, a scroll in hand, his eyes forever cast downward in thought. Few bowed before them. But in the quiet hours when only oil lamps flickered and birds hushed, there were those who remembered. Narcissus, faithful secretary, fell from favor under Nero's rule. Some say he kept Claudius's letters, bound in linen and tucked beneath the marble of a hidden alcove. His voice faded, but his loyalty lived in silence. Britannicus, the son for whom Claudius had hesitated too long, would not live to avenge or reclaim. Within a year, poisoned too, gone like a breath, his name spoken only in bitter poetry. Yet the foundations Claudius laid held firm. The aqueducts still sang with water, echoing through arches he had revived. The port of Ostia thrived for centuries, carrying grain and wine, ivory and whispers across the sea. His legal reforms shaped the senatorial courts for generations. His books, though many were lost, were remembered in fragments, quoted by scholars, honored in margins. He had not conquered like Caesar, nor burned like Caligula. He had not dazzled like Augustus. But his reign was like a quiet room in a storm, a place where Rome could catch its breath. And so, Claudius faded not in scandal, nor rage, nor myth, but in time. He was buried near the gardens of Lucullus, under soft olive trees where breeze and birdsong coiled like prayers. Agrippina gave him a funeral fitting an emperor, though her tears, if any, were dry. Nero spoke the words, golden robes rustling as the pyre was lit. The flames rose slowly, consuming not just a man, but the gentlest era of Julio-Claudian rule. Even now, some say if you walk the hills beyond Ostia at dusk, past cracked columns and wild rosemary, you might hear the faintest echo of turning pages. The gentle sound of a scholar emperor at work, rewriting the soul of an empire. Long after the torches of Claudius's reign flickered out, the empire walked quietly in the footprints he left behind. The marble did not forget him. In hidden libraries and windswept forums, the name Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus remained carved, not in haste, but in careful, enduring strokes. Though time crumbled statues and lichen-veiled inscriptions, his legacy lingered like the faint scent of parchment and olive oil in an old scholar's study. He had not ruled with fire, he had ruled with thought. Long after his death, children studied the aqueducts he revived. Aqua Claudia, that silver river of stone, still ran high above the valley's each drop, whispering the name of the emperor who brought water back to a thirsty Rome. The port of Ostia, though weathered by time and tide, continued to feed the capital for centuries. Merchants, unaware of their benefactor, passed beneath arches bearing his name. And his words. Though many of his books were lost in the great fires of later emperors, quotes survived like starlight through a broken dome. He had written of the Etruscans, of Carthage, of law and letters, of languages and love. Later, historians, even as they mocked him, could not help but turn their eyes toward his forgotten tomes. They saw, beneath the stammering voice, a mind that had reached far deeper than they first believed. It was not only buildings and books he left behind, it was the idea of Rome as a home to many. By opening the Senate to the provinces, Claudius stretched the soul of the empire across mountains and seas. Gauls and Iberians, once mocked as barbarians, now wore purple-trimmed togas. Statues in far-off towns bore his imagino as a god or warrior, but as a listener, a learner, a bringer of law. Even Nero, his successor and stepson, though more torch than lamp, could not undo all his work. The roads held, the laws held, the people remembered. And in the quiet corners of Rome, among vine-draped ruins, his story was still told. Not loudly, not with trumpets, but softly, like the turning of a scroll in the dark. The footsteps of emperors echo loudest in marble halls, but even the strongest stone weathers beneath centuries of rain and silence. After Claudius's passing, the empire moved onward, as empires go grinding, shifting, forgetting. His name, once inscribed in fresh stone, began to fade beneath vines and soot. His reforms lived on, but not always in his name. And as Nero's fires rose and madness returned to the Palatine, many whispered that Claudius had only postponed chaos, not conquered it. Yet those who looked closely saw the threads he had sewn. The Aqua Claudia still ran. The harbor at Ostia still fed Rome. Provincial senators still held seats once denied. And in the quiet corners of academies and temples, where history was copied by slow, ink-stained hands, his writings were sometimes read. Scholars puzzled over his grammar. They smirked at his stammer preserved in prose. But a few paused long enough to see the shape of a deeper mind beneath the ink. He was not worshipped like Augustus, nor feared like Tiberius. His statues were fewer, his triumphs were quieter, but his influence stretched far in ways few could name. Some emperors, like comets, burned brilliant and brief. Claudius had been more like a steady lamp in a scholar's room. He had not craved divinity, but after his death, the Senate voted to deify him. Irony, perhaps, for a man who loved the past more than Olympus. But statues of Divus Claudius were erected, often with scrolls in hand, not swords. In Britannia, altars bore his name. In Gaul, his policies shaped a generation of administrators and merchants. And in Rome, long after his family line had perished in fire and intrigue, the aqueducts still whispered his legacy. But his memory, like the twilight, grew soft. Years blurred the borders of his reign. Later historians, eager for scandal, reduced him to a footnote, the limping fool who stumbled into power. They chose to forget the work beneath the surface. The weight he carried. The empire he held together with parchment and patience. Still, when the winds turned and rustled through broken courtyards, some say they hear the faintest echo, not of triumphal marches or war drums, but of pages turning. And now, the candle burns low in the villa of memory. The scrolls have all been written, sealed, and left to time. The sandals of senators no longer echo with urgency, and the Palatine Hill slumbers beneath stars older than Rome itself. Claudius is gone. Not with thunder, nor with the scream of blades, but as softly as a leaf falling on a marble floor. His eyes, once wide with wonder and worry, closed one final time on that cool October night in 54 AD. The air was quiet in the imperial chambers. Agrippina was there, watching. Nero stood not far, already casting a long and hungry shadow. Some say it was poison, a plate of mushrooms served with care and calculation. Others say it was age, or exhaustion, or a broken heart. Perhaps he knew that he had walked as far as he could, that the world would turn once more, faster now, and not in the direction he had hoped. But even as the empire shifted, something of Claudius remained. In the silence between columns, in the breath of fountains fed by aqueducts, in the rhythm of Roman law, still shaped by his hand, in the grain-laden ships guided by harbors he built, and in the stories whispered beneath candlelight. For Claudius was never meant to be emperor, not by bloodlust or ambition. His was a reign of accident or fate, or the gods' strange sense of balance. And yet, in that unlikely journey, he gave the empire not brilliance, but calm. Not fire, but warmth. Not a storm, but a steady, guiding wind. And so we leave him now, seated eternally with the scroll in hand. The toga drapes gently, the marble is cracked, moss grows at his feet, but he does not mind. His words have outlived his breath. His justice, his vision, the quiet strength of his mind all still move, unseen beneath Rome's golden dust. And if you listen closely, if the night is still, you may hear him in the hush between the rustling leaves. The softest voice saying, "I was not mighty, but I was mindful. I was not feared, but I was fair. I did not conquer, but I built. Sleep well now. Let time carry you gently." And in the cradle of dreams, may the empire of Claudius rise once more in peace, in thought, in the soft rhythm of memory.